Police officer Jonathan arrests a black boy, thinking he caught a thief stealing from a grocery store. But when the surprising truth is revealed, Jonathan's world falls apart, making him question everything he believed in. How will this one moment of mistaken judgment change their lives? Jonathan Bradley, a dedicated police officer, walked confidently down Main Street in his sharp blue uniform. At 55, he was well known in the small town of Millbrook, having served on the police force for over 30 years. As he passed by familiar faces, he tipped his hat and felt proud of the respect he had earned over the years. "Good morning, Officer Bradley," called out Mrs. Winston from her flower shop. "Good morning, ma'am," Jonathan replied, smiling. "Those roses look great today." Continuing his patrol, Jonathan kept an eye out for any trouble. He believed that keeping order was essential for a happy community. He took pride in knowing everyone in town and watching over them. As he turned the corner, Jonathan spotted a group of teenagers hanging out in front of the convenience store. He approached them with a serious expression. "Everything okay here, boys?" he asked, his voice firm. "Yes, sir," one of them answered nervously. "We're just waiting for Jimmy's mum to pick us up." Jonathan's eyes fell on a young black boy in the group, and he felt a hint of suspicion. "Just don't hang around for too long," he warned. "We don't want any trouble." As he walked away, he didn't see the hurt on the boy's face or the uncomfortable looks exchanged among the friends. Jonathan thought he was just doing his job, keeping an eye on things. Later that day, Jonathan received a call about a fight at the local diner. When he entered, he saw two men arguing loudly. One was Mr. Peterson, a long-time resident, and the other was a younger man Jonathan didn't recognize. "What's the problem here, gentlemen?" Jonathan asked as he approached them. Mr. Peterson spoke first. "This guy is trying to use a counterfeit bill, Jonathan. I caught him red-handed." Jonathan turned to the younger man, who wore worn jeans and a faded t-shirt. Without thinking, Jonathan's hand rested on his holster. "Is that true?" he asked, sounding stern. The young man's eyes widened in fear. "No, sir. I didn't know it was fake. I just got paid today from the construction site." Jonathan looked skeptical. He didn't realize how quickly he had assumed the young man was guilty just because of his appearance. "Show me some ID," he ordered, his voice firm. As Jonathan checked the man's driver's license and the suspicious bill, he didn't see how his own biases influenced his view of the situation. To him, he was being careful, not noticing how his prejudices affected his actions. The next day, the sun blazed down on Millbrook. 14-year-old Kendrick raced through the streets, his heart racing. He was tall for his age, but today he felt small and vulnerable as he clutched a brown paper bag close to his chest. Inside were groceries and, most importantly, the medicine his mother desperately needed. "Hang on, Mama," Kendrick whispered as he dodged pedestrians on the busy sidewalk. "I'm on my way." Sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he couldn't slow down. Every second mattered. His mother, Carla, had been sick for weeks, and her condition was getting worse. The thought of her waiting for him pushed Kendrick to run even faster. As he rounded a corner, the bag rustled loudly. An elderly woman jumped, clutching her purse tightly as he rushed by. Kendrick barely noticed. His mind was solely focused on getting home. "Sorry, ma'am," he called back without stopping. The streets of Millbrook blurred as he ran. He passed the old church where he used to go to Sunday school and the park where he once played happily. But those carefree days felt long gone. Since his mother fell ill, Kendrick's world had shrunk to the space between their small house and the store, filled with worries and responsibilities that felt far too heavy for a boy his age. Kendrick's lungs felt like they were on fire as he ran toward his street. The bag in his hands grew heavier with every step, but he gripped it tightly. Knowing what was inside was vital. He could finally see his house, a small single-story building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. It wasn't perfect, but it was home, and more importantly, his mother was waiting for him. "I'm almost there, Mama," Kendrick panted, his feet pounding on the pavement. With each step, he felt more nervous, sensing something unusual in the air. As he rushed up the walkway to his front door, he had no idea of the trouble that was about to unfold. He was solely focused on getting the life-saving medicine to his sick mother. The next day, Kendrick went back to the store for more medicine. As he burst out of the grocery store, his heart racing and his arms tightly holding the important bag, Officer Jonathan Bradley spotted him. The experienced cop had been patrolling the area, scanning the streets with the keen eyes of someone who had spent years on the force. "Hey you! Stop right there!" Jonathan's voice echoed across the parking lot, making Kendrick stumble in surprise. The boy's eyes widened in fear as he saw the officer approaching, his blue uniform standing out against the sun-baked pavement. Confusion washed over Kendrick's face. "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong." Kendrick stuttered, his voice shaky. "Please, I need to get home. My mama..." But Officer Jonathan didn't listen. He had already formed a story in his mind that this young boy running from the store must be a thief. "Show me what you have in your pockets," Jonathan ordered, his hand resting on his belt. "Put that bag down slowly." Kendrick felt tears welling up in his eyes as the situation hit him. "Officer, please," he cried, his voice breaking. "I paid for everything. My mum is sick and I need to give her this medicine." Jonathan's face stayed cold and hard. Years of hearing what he thought were excuses had made him less understanding. "I said to put the bag down and show me your pockets now." With shaking hands, Kendrick placed the bag on the ground. He began searching his pockets, hoping to find the receipt, but he realized he had left it at home in his hurry to get back. "But I didn't steal anything. Please, my mama needs me." But Jonathan had already made up his mind. He pulled out his handcuffs, the metal shining in the bright sunlight. "I'm arresting you for suspicion of theft. You have the right to remain silent." As the cold metal closed around Kendrick's wrists, he let out a sob. "No, please. You don't understand. My mum needs her medicine. She's waiting for me." People began to gather, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Some whispered to each other while others looked away, uncomfortable. "Officer, maybe you should listen to him," one bystander said bravely, but Jonathan brushed them off. "This is police work," he replied firmly. "Please, step back." As Jonathan led Kendrick to the patrol car, the boy's cries became more desperate. "Please, sir, call my grandma. She'll tell you I'm telling the truth. My mum is really sick." But Jonathan stood firm, convinced he was doing the right thing. He couldn't see past his own assumptions or hear the truth in Kendrick's shaky voice. As the car door slammed shut, Kendrick's last sight was of the brown paper bag sitting sadly on the sidewalk, the medicine for his mother now just out of reach. The police car arrived at the station, its lights creating strange shadows in the dimming light. Officer Jonathan got out, his face serious as he opened the back door and helped Kendrick step out of the vehicle. "Come on, son," Jonathan said in a firm but gentle voice. "Let's get this sorted out." Kendrick stumbled as he got out, his legs weak and his heart racing. The handcuffs pressed uncomfortably against his wrists, reminding him of the nightmare he was living. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he gazed up at the big brick building in front of him. "Please, officer," Kendrick begged one last time. "My mama needs her medicine. Just check the store. They'll say I paid." Jonathan shook his head as he led Kendrick inside. "We'll figure this out. Don't worry." Inside the station, the bright lights buzzed overhead, shining harshly on the tile floors. The smell of coffee and paper filled the air as Jonathan took Kendrick to a small room on the side. "Wait here," Jonathan said, removing the handcuffs. "I'll be back to take your statement." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Kendrick alone in the plain, windowless room. He sank into a hard plastic chair, trembling with fear and frustration. His mind raced with thoughts of his mother, sick at home and waiting for the medicine that would not arrive. "Mama," he whispered, fresh tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Mama." Each tick of the clock on the wall felt like a painful reminder. Every minute meant his mother could be getting worse. He imagined her struggling to breathe, worrying about where he was and why he hadn't returned with her medicine. Outside the room, Jonathan sat at his desk, filling out paperwork. He felt a slight doubt about the situation as he remembered Kendrick's desperate pleas, but quickly pushed it away. He had been on the force for years and knew how to spot a thief. Yet something nagged at him. Back in the small room, Kendrick's frustration grew. He paced back and forth, fists clenched at his sides. How could this be happening? He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, stuck in a police station while his mother suffered at home. "I have to get out of here," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to help Mama." But the door stayed shut, leaving Kendrick alone with his fears and rising anger. He slumped back into the chair, burying his face in his hands as he cried. All he could think about was his mother, alone and sick, waiting for a son who wouldn't be coming home. Just then, the station door opened, and an older woman stepped inside. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she walked with a calm strength that showed her worry. This was Mrs. Patterson, Kendrick's grandmother. She walked to the front desk, her voice steady but urgent. "I'm here for my grandson Kendrick. There's been a terrible mistake." Officer Jonathan looked up from his paperwork, his brow furrowing. "Ma'am, I'm afraid your grandson was caught shoplifting." Mrs. Patterson raised a hand, gently stopping Officer Jonathan. "Officer, please listen. Kendrick would never steal. He was rushing home with medicine for his mother. My daughter. She's very sick." For the first time, Jonathan felt uncertain. He leaned closer, paying attention as Mrs. Patterson spoke. "Carla is my daughter. She's been sick with pneumonia for weeks. Kendrick has been taking care of her, running errands and getting her medicine. He's such a good boy. He was only trying to help." As she talked, Jonathan's understanding deepened. A heavy feeling settled in his stomach. He remembered Kendrick's frightened eyes and desperate pleas. Had he really been so quick to judge? "Mom," Jonathan said softly, "can you tell me more about your daughter's illness?" Tears filled Mrs. Patterson's eyes. "She can hardly get out of bed. The medicine Kendrick was bringing is vital for her recovery. Every minute counts." Jonathan's face went pale as he realized the weight of his actions. He had let his assumptions blind him, and now a sick woman was suffering because of it. "I'm so sorry," Jonathan said, the words feeling inadequate. "Let me get Kendrick right away." Jonathan hurried to the room where Kendrick was waiting, Mrs. Patterson's words echoing in his mind. He had made a serious mistake, one that could lead to terrible consequences. The weight of this realization made each step feel heavier. At the door, Jonathan paused, taking a deep breath. He knew he had to make things right, but first needed to face the boy he had wrongly accused. The boy just trying to help his sick mother. Jonathan opened the door, feeling regret. Kendrick sat on a bench, worry on his face. When he glanced at Jonathan, he quickly looked away. "Kendrick," Jonathan said softly, "your grandmother is here. You can go now." As they walked back to the front desk, Jonathan's guilt grew. Mrs. Patterson stood there, calm yet disappointed. "Mrs. Patterson, Kendrick," Jonathan began, voice thick with emotion. "I made a big mistake. I'm sorry." Mrs. Patterson nodded quietly while Kendrick remained silent. "I should have listened," Jonathan continued. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Kendrick stared at the floor, saying nothing. "We need to get Carla her medicine," Mrs. Patterson said gently. Jonathan offered, "Let me drive you home." As they left, Jonathan noticed Kendrick's old, worn-out slippers. He hadn't realized the struggles they faced before. Driving them home, Jonathan's thoughts were heavy. He questioned his earlier judgment and realized he had been wrong to assume the worst. His gut feeling, which he trusted for years, had failed him this time. At home, Kendrick handed his mother her medicine. Carla, weak but smiling, thanked him. Sensing his sadness, she asked, Are you okay, sweetheart? Kendrick hesitated, then finally said, I got arrested, Mama. They thought I stole something. Carla gasped, pulling him close. Kendrick cried silently, overwhelmed with anger and fear. Mrs. Patterson comforted him, saying, What happened wasn't fair. Kendrick, wiping his eyes, asked, Why did they think I stole? I didn't do anything wrong. Carla sighed, stroking his hair. Sometimes people make bad judgments, but it doesn't make it right. Kendrick nodded, but the words didn't ease his feelings. He felt a mix of anger, fear, and confusion. The world seemed less fair and safe than before. The next morning, Officer Jonathan stood on Kendrick's porch with grocery bags. Nervous, he rang the bell. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, surprised. Officer Bradley, she said, cautious. I brought groceries and something for Kendrick, Jonathan said, revealing a shoebox. Mrs. Patterson softened a little and let him in. The living room was simple, but worn, showing signs of the family's struggles. Kendrick walked in and froze, seeing Jonathan. His face showed fear and uncertainty. Hello, Kendrick, Jonathan said, holding out the shoebox. I saw your shoes were worn yesterday. I thought you might need these. Kendrick stayed silent. Mrs. Patterson took the box. Thank you, she said softly. Jonathan set the groceries down, his heart heavy at Kendrick's reaction. I'm really sorry, Kendrick. I made a mistake. Kendrick stared at the floor. Mrs. Patterson touched his shoulder. Thank you for stopping by, she said kindly. Jonathan nodded and left, feeling broken. He drove aimlessly, finally stopping by the river. Alone in his car, he cried, overwhelmed by guilt. His quick judgment had caused deep hurt, and he realized the full impact of his actions. That Monday, Kendrick walked to school wearing the new shoes Jonathan had given him, but he kept his head down. People stared and whispered. There he is, someone said. He got arrested. Kendrick's face reddened as he fumbled with his locker. In class, his friend Marcus chose to sit away from him. At lunch, Kendrick sat alone, his usual spot taken by others. Hey, Kendrick, Jessica from math class called. Did you get arrested? My mom saw you at the police station. Kendrick's throat tightened. It was a mistake, he mumbled. I didn't do anything wrong. Jessica raised an eyebrow. Sure, she said doubtfully and walked away, leaving Kendrick feeling more alone. Days passed, but the whispers didn't stop. Kendrick's phone, once buzzing with messages, fell silent. No one invited him to study groups or basketball games. His grades started dropping as he struggled to focus, thinking about his mum's illness and the shame of his arrest. One afternoon, his English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, asked him to stay after class. Kendrick, she said gently, I've noticed you've been distracted. Is everything okay? Kendrick's eyes filled with tears, but he just shook his head. I'm fine, he muttered. Walking home, the weight of his problems pressed down on him. The stress of his mom's sickness and the isolation at school felt overwhelming. He missed the days when he was just a regular kid, liked by his classmates. The next day, in history class, Mr. Johnson asked if anyone wanted to talk about current events. Sarah, a quiet girl, raised her hand. I want to talk about rumors and how they hurt people, she said. Like what happened to Kendrick. The room went silent. Kendrick looked up, surprised. Sarah explained how she'd seen him at the store, rushing to get medicine for his mom. He didn't steal anything, she said. Nobody listened to him. Mr. Johnson thanked Sarah for her courage. As she spoke, Kendrick noticed some of his classmates looking at him differently, some with guilt in their eyes. After class, Marcus approached Kendrick. Hey man, I'm sorry for believing those rumors, he said. Kendrick nodded, not fully ready to forgive but appreciating the apology. That night, Kendrick sat by his mum's bed. Carla's breathing was rough, and Mrs. Patterson was clearly worried. Suddenly, Carla started coughing badly. Grandma! Kendrick shouted, panic rising. Mrs. Patterson called an ambulance, and soon paramedics arrived to take Carla to the hospital. At the hospital, Kendrick and Mrs. Patterson waited anxiously. A doctor finally came to tell them that Carla had pneumonia and would need to stay for a while. The next day, Kendrick saw his grandma at the kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills. "How bad is it, Grandma?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson tried to reassure him, but Kendrick knew the truth. The bills were piling up and they didn't have the money. That night, Kendrick lay in bed, unable to sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about his mom, the medical bills, and the fear of losing her. He felt helpless. Meanwhile, at the police station, Jonathan sat at his desk, guilt eating at him. He couldn't forget Kendrick's worn shoes or the fear in his eyes. Determined to help, he started calling local businesses to organize a fundraiser for Kendrick's mum. Some calls went well, others didn't. But the owner of the local diner agreed to host a benefit dinner. While putting up flyers at the community center, Jonathan overheard two men talking. "Did you hear about that fundraiser for the Patterson family?" one asked. "Yeah," the other replied. "I'm not sure why we should help them. They're probably just looking for a handout." Jonathan's stomach turned, but instead of arguing, he approached them with a smile. "Excuse me, I'm organizing the fundraiser. Carla Patterson is very sick, and the family is struggling with medical bills. They're good people going through a tough time. I hope you'll consider coming to the benefit dinner next week." The men looked uncomfortable, giving vague answers before walking away. Jonathan sighed, realizing how deep people's biases were, but he didn't give up. He went to the local church, spoke to the pastor, and went door to door in Kendrick's neighborhood, sharing the family's situation. As Jonathan did this, he noticed a change in himself. Each conversation, an act of kindness, made him rethink his views. He began to see the community as people, each with their own struggles. One afternoon, while putting up flyers at the grocery store, Jonathan ran into Sarah. "Officer Jonathan," she said, surprised. "Are you organizing this for Kendrick's family?" Jonathan nodded. "I am. I made a mistake, and I'm trying to fix it." Sarah smiled. "That's really kind. Can I help?" Jonathan handed her flyers. "We could use help spreading the word. Could you put these up at school?" Sarah nodded. "Of course." She left with the flyers, and Jonathan felt hopeful. The community was slowly coming together. Meanwhile, Kendrick was overwhelmed with emotions. His mum's illness, his arrest, and school pressure. Kneeling by his bed, he prayed, "Dear God, please help my mum. She's so sick, and I'm scared. I don't know what to do." Tears flowed as he continued, "Help me forgive Officer Jonathan. It's hard. Please give me strength." As Kendrick prayed, he felt warmth in his chest, like a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for listening, God," he whispered. Feeling a little more at peace, he went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. As news of Carla's illness spread, the community came together. The benefit dinner at Joe's Diner was a success, with neighbors and local businesses showing up. Kendrick stood by the entrance, watching as people donated money and bid on auction items. A small smile crossed his face. Mrs. Patterson squeezed his shoulder. "See, Kendrick, people care. We're not alone." The money raised wasn't enough to cover all the bills, but it was a start. Kendrick felt a flicker of hope, but that hope was tested the next day. Jonathan got bad news. The charity that could have helped more denied their application because Kendrick's arrest was still on his record. Jonathan's heart sank. He knew he had to break the news to the family. He drove to Kendrick's house, knocked, and Mrs. Patterson opened the door. "Officer Bradley," she said carefully. "What brings you here?" Jonathan swallowed. "I'm afraid I have bad news. The charity denied your application because of Kendrick's arrest." Kendrick appeared behind his grandmother, looking tired. Jonathan continued, "I tried to explain, but they wouldn't listen." Kendrick's face fell. "But it was a mistake. You said you'd fix it." Jonathan felt crushed. I know, Kendrick. I'm sorry. I'll keep trying. But Kendrick turned away, disappearing into the house. Mrs. Patterson looked at Jonathan with sympathy and disappointment. "Thank you for telling us," she said softly, closing the door. Jonathan stood on the porch, feeling the weight of his guilt. He had tried to make things right, but his mistake was still hurting Kendrick's family. Determined to fix things, Jonathan began investigating the charity. He found that they had a history of discriminating against minority applicants, often using small issues to deny aid. Shocked, Jonathan gathered all the evidence and went to the local newspaper. The editor, Melinda Santos, listened as Jonathan explained everything. "This is huge," Melinda said, her eyes wide. "Are you sure you want to make this public?" Jonathan nodded. "It's the right thing to do. People need help, and they're being turned away for the wrong reasons." The next day, the story was on the front page of the Millbrook Gazette. The headline said, "Local charity accused of discrimination in aid distribution." The article discussed Jonathan's findings, highlighting Kendrick's story as a strong example of the charity's unfair practices. The reaction was quick and strong. Social media filled with anger, and local TV stations covered the story. People who had stayed quiet about their own experiences with the charity began to speak out, adding to the growing outrage. Under pressure from the public, the charity's board held an emergency meeting. They released a statement apologizing for their past actions and promised to review all previously denied applications. More importantly, they reversed their decision on Kendrick's case and agreed to pay Carla's medical bills. News of the charity's change spread quickly through the small town. People stopped Jonathan on the street to shake his hand and praised him for doing the right thing. But Jonathan didn't feel proud. He only felt relief that he had helped fix some of the damage he had caused. At Kendrick's house, there was a feeling of cautious hope. Mrs. Patterson cried with joy when she heard the news, but Kendrick stayed quiet. The emotional pain of the last few weeks had left deep marks that wouldn't heal easily. When Jonathan came by to share the good news in person, Kendrick listened without saying anything, his eyes fixed on the floor. Even as his grandmother thanked Jonathan, Kendrick couldn't look at the officer who had turned his life upside down. "Thank you," Kendrick finally whispered, but saying it took a lot out of him, and he quickly went to his room, leaving Jonathan and Mrs. Patterson in an awkward silence. As Jonathan left, he realized that while he had fixed the practical issues he caused, healing the emotional damage would take much longer. The weight of his actions still pressed on him, reminding him of how harmful unconscious bias can be. In the weeks that followed, hope slowly returned to Kendrick's family. Carla's condition, once serious and hopeless, began to improve. The doctors, who had once looked worried, now allowed themselves small smiles when checking her progress. Every day, as soon as school ended, Kendrick ran to the hospital. His backpack bounced on his shoulders as he rushed, filled with both hope and fear. The smell of the hospital no longer bothered him as he made his way to his mother's room. "Hey, Mom," Kendrick said quietly when he entered. Carla's eyes lit up when she saw him, though she was often too weak to speak. Kendrick sat in the chair next to her bed, pulling out his homework. While he worked on his assignments, he talked to her about his day. He told her about Sarah standing up for him at school, the fundraisers helping pay for her treatment, and the little acts of kindness he started to notice in the community. "Mum, the doctors say you're getting better," Kendrick said, his voice full of emotion. "They say the medicine is working." Carla squeezed his hand gently, her eyes showing her love and determination. Even though she was weak, she kept fighting, drawing strength from Kendrick's visits. As more help from the community came in, Kendrick found himself praying more often. Each night, he knelt by his bed, hands clasped tight. "Please, God," he whispered, tears falling down his face. "Please help Mum get better. I need her. I can't do this without her. In the hospital, every little win felt big. Carla's fever went down, her breathing became easier, and she stayed awake longer, even eating small bites of food. The doctors were still careful with their optimism, warning not to get too hopeful. But for Kendrick, each tiny improvement gave him hope. He felt like his prayers were being answered. "Your mum's a fighter," Nurse Joanna told Kendrick one day, patting his shoulder. "And you're right there fighting with her. That's a powerful thing." Kendrick nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe things might get better. The next day, Officer Jonathan's police car pulled into Kendrick's driveway, crunching on the gravel. Jonathan took a deep breath, preparing for another possibly awkward visit. He carried a bag of groceries and a new notebook for Kendrick's schoolwork. As he walked up to the door, his heart raced. He knocked softly, and Mrs. Patterson opened the door with a tired but kind smile. "Officer Jonathan," she said warmly. "Come on in." Jonathan stepped inside and noticed Kendrick sitting at the dining table, focused on his textbooks. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his work. "I brought some groceries," Jonathan said, placing the bag on the kitchen counter, "and a new notebook for Kendrick. I thought it might help with school." Mrs. Patterson thanked him, and Jonathan moved slowly toward Kendrick. "Hey, Kendrick," he said quietly. "How's school going?" Kendrick shrugged without looking up. "It's fine," he mumbled. Jonathan pulled out a chair and sat down. "Mind if I take a look? Maybe I can help." Kendrick didn't answer at first, but eventually pushed his math textbook toward Jonathan. As they worked through the problems, Jonathan noticed Kendrick relaxing a little. His answers became longer, and he even asked a couple of questions about the harder problems. When they finished math, Jonathan spotted a history book in Kendrick's backpack. "You studying the Civil War?" he asked. Kendrick nodded. "We have a test next week." "I used to love history," Jonathan said. "Want me to quiz you?" Jonathan stood on the front porch staring at the door. His heart raced and he felt nervous about what to say. He had come with a purpose, but now doubt filled his mind. Taking a deep breath, he knocked, the sound echoing louder than he expected. Mrs. Patterson opened the door, looking tired but patient. "Officer Jonathan," she said softly. "Is everything all right?" Jonathan took a deep breath. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to talk to you about something important. May I come in?" She nodded and stepped aside. They sat down in the quiet living room, the tension heavy between them. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Jonathan began. "That day I arrested Kendrick. I was wrong. I judged him because of how he looked." He paused, swallowing hard. "I assumed the worst without listening, and I'm deeply sorry." Jonathan kept his eyes on the floor, afraid of Mrs. Patterson's reaction. But when she spoke, her voice was calm, though sad. "Officer Jonathan, that day changed everything for Kendrick," she said. "It takes courage to admit what you just did." Jonathan finally looked up. "I know I hurt him. I want to change and make it right." Mrs. Patterson sighed, her expression a mix of weariness and grace. "You can't undo what's been done, but recognizing it is the first step. Kendrick needs time to trust again." Jonathan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I'll keep trying, for him and for myself." Her gaze softened. "You're taking the right steps. Now let's see if you'll keep walking down that road." The community center buzzed with energy. Laughter and chatter filled the air, and the smell of homemade food wafted through. Colorful banners hung on the walls, and tables were lined with donations for Carla's medical bills. Kendrick stood nervously to the side, holding a small piece of paper. Mrs. Patterson placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready, Kendrick?" He nodded, taking a deep breath. "I think so, Grandma," he said quietly. As everyone settled, Jonathan stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. We're here to support a wonderful family in our community. Now, I'd like to invite Kendrick up to say a few words. Kendrick walked slowly to the front, his heart racing. He saw familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, and classmates. Taking another deep breath, he began to speak. "I just want to say thank you for coming today," Kendrick said, his voice shaking at first but growing steadier. "A little while ago, I didn't know how we were going to get through this. My mom was so sick, and everything seemed hopeless." He paused, his eyes glistening. "But then, you all stepped in. You brought us food, raised money, and most importantly, you gave us hope." As he spoke, the room grew quiet, and some people wiped away tears. Kendrick continued, his voice filled with emotion. "In the darkest times, I've learned that there's always light. You've all been that light for us. And because of you, my mum is getting better." Kendrick's eyes searched the room, his gratitude clear. "I don't know how to thank you enough, but one day, I'll pay it forward. I'll help others, just like you've helped us." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. People stood, clapping and cheering for the young boy who had touched their hearts. Kendrick stepped down, and his grandmother pulled him into a tight hug. As they held each other, it felt like the love and support of the entire community wrapped around them. Days passed, and slowly, Carla's health improved. The doctors were hopeful but cautious, reminding everyone that she still had a long way to go. Her hospital room was now filled with cards, flowers, and small gifts from the people in town. After school each day, Kendrick rushed to the hospital to see his mum. The nurses greeted him warmly as he made his way to her room. "Mum!" Kendrick called out as he walked in, his face lighting up when he saw Carla sitting up in bed. Carla smiled at him, her eyes filled with love. "There's my boy," she said, her voice tired but happy. Kendrick sat in the chair next to her, excited to tell her about his day. "You won't believe what happened in math class today," he said, launching into a story about a tough problem he solved. Carla listened, smiling and proud as she held his hand. "How are things at home?" Carla asked when Kendrick took a breath. "It's okay, Mom," Kendrick replied. "Everyone's been so kind. Mrs. Johnson brought us dinner, and Mr. Peter even mowed our lawn." Carla's eyes filled with tears. "This community, they've been amazing." Kendrick nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yeah, they really have. I didn't know so many people cared." They sat quietly for a moment, the love between them growing stronger. Carla squeezed Kendrick's hand. "Seeing you every day gives me the strength to keep fighting." Kendrick's eyes welled up. "I'm not leaving you, Mum. We're in this together." Weeks passed, and Officer Jonathan Bradley couldn't shake the guilt he felt over what had happened with Kendrick. It weighed on him daily, pushing him to reflect on his actions and his role as a police officer. One evening, sitting alone in his living room, he held his badge in his hand, staring at it. He thought about what it truly meant to serve the people around him. With a heavy sigh, he whispered to himself, "I need to do better. For Kendrick, for everyone." The next day, Jonathan walked into the police station with a new sense of purpose. He went straight to his boss, the chief, and asked for a meeting. "Chief," Jonathan began, his voice firm but filled with emotion, "we need to change how we work with the people in our town." The chief looked surprised. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Jonathan took a deep breath. "I want to start a program that brings officers and people together. We need to build trust and really understand each other." In the following weeks, Jonathan dedicated himself to this mission. He organized meetings where officers and residents could talk openly. At first, only a few people showed up, and there was a lot of tension, but Jonathan didn't give up. He encouraged honest conversations about police work and what the community needed. He also started volunteering at a youth center, spending time with kids from different backgrounds. Jonathan found himself learning just as much from the kids as they were from him. His time with them challenged his old way of thinking and opened his mind. One afternoon at the center, Jonathan noticed a boy sitting alone, looking nervous. The boy reminded Jonathan of Kendrick, and he felt a pull in his chest. He walked over, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Hey," Jonathan said quietly. "Are you okay?" As time passed, Officer Jonathan Bradley found himself thinking more about his mistakes and how to make things right. He couldn't forget how he had misjudged Kendrick, and it pushed him to become a better person. One day, he saw a boy sitting alone at the youth center, looking nervous. The boy reminded him of Kendrick. Jonathan sat next to him and spoke gently. "You know," Jonathan began, "I once made a big mistake. I judged someone before really knowing them. But I learned that it's never too late to change." The boy looked up at Jonathan, his fear slowly fading, and they began to talk. Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he could make a difference by helping one person at a time. Back at the station, Jonathan talked more with his fellow officers about treating people with respect and understanding. He shared his own story and encouraged others to think about how they did their jobs. "We're here to help everyone," he often said. "That means treating everyone fairly, no matter who they are." Some of the officers didn't like hearing this. They were set in their ways, but Jonathan stayed firm. Little by little, he made a positive impact, showing by example how they could do better. Meanwhile, Kendrick started to feel more confident. With Jonathan's support and the kindness of his community, he began to come out of his shell. At school, he started speaking up in class more often. His teachers noticed the change, and one day, Mrs. Johnson, his English teacher, pulled him aside after class. "Kendrick," she said kindly, "you're doing great work. Your last essay was amazing." Kendrick felt proud. "Thanks, Mrs. Johnson," he replied with a small smile. As his confidence grew, so did his grades. He worked hard on his studies, finding new purpose in learning. One day, Jonathan visited Kendrick's home with a stack of books about different careers. Kendrick looked at them with curiosity as Jonathan set them down on the table. "I thought you might want to explore these," Jonathan said gently. "There are so many possibilities for your future." Kendrick picked up a book about medicine. As he flipped through it, something sparked inside him. He thought of his mother, who was getting stronger every day thanks to the care of her doctors and nurses. "Maybe I could be a doctor," Kendrick said quietly. "I could help people like they helped my mum." Jonathan's face lit up with pride. "You can do anything, Kendrick. You're smart, and you care about others. That's what it takes to be a great doctor." From that moment, Kendrick threw himself into his schoolwork with new determination. He joined the science club and enjoyed every experiment and project. His classmates, who once didn't pay much attention to him, now asked for his help with their assignments. As Kendrick grew more confident, he also wanted to give back. He remembered how the community had supported him and his family during tough times, and now he wanted to help others. With Jonathan's encouragement, Kendrick started tutoring younger kids at the community center. One Saturday morning, Kendrick was helping a little girl named Lily read. When she finally sounded out a difficult word, her face lit up with joy. Kendrick smiled, feeling proud of her. "You did it, Lily," he said, giving her a high five. Lily skipped off to show her parents what she had learned, and Kendrick noticed Jonathan watching him from across the room. Jonathan gave him a thumbs up, and Kendrick smiled back. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about what was ahead. Later, sunlight filtered into Carla's hospital room. Kendrick stood by her bedside, holding a red rose. Jonathan was there too, silent but supportive. The sound of the heart monitor echoed softly in the room, a reminder that Carla was getting better. Kendrick's hand trembled as he placed the rose gently on her blanket. "It's a beautiful flower," Jonathan said quietly, his voice full of emotion. Kendrick nodded, unable to speak as his throat tightened with feelings. He reached out and held his mother's hand, gripping it gently. Jonathan put a hand on Kendrick's shoulder. What once felt impossible between them now felt natural. In the month since the arrest, Jonathan had worked hard to earn Kendrick's trust and to be a positive part of his life. "She's getting stronger every day," Jonathan said, his eyes filled with hope. "The doctors think she'll be able to come home soon." Kendrick looked up at Jonathan, a small smile on his lips. "I can't wait," he whispered. Standing together, Kendrick and Jonathan thought about the path that had led them here. The pain and misunderstandings were behind them now, replaced by a bond that had grown through effort and care. Jonathan had changed too. He had become more patient, more understanding, and more connected to the people he served. Kendrick, once filled with anger and fear, now stood with quiet strength. His hope for the future was clear in his eyes. As they both looked at Carla, resting peacefully, the rose on her blanket seemed to represent all the love and hope they shared. The hard times weren't completely over, but they now faced them with the support of each other and their community. It's over to you guys. What's your thoughts on this remarkable story? Let us know in the comments. Until then, take care.